Hey, welcome to the FAR podcast. I'm Andrew Austin. I'm Associate Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. I've published numerous reviews, articles, encyclopedic articles in academic outlets, as well as some in more popular outlets. I run the blog Freedom and Reason, which you can read at andrewaustin.blog, and there you'll find closing in on 550 essays, long form, many of them, most of them, and I talk about race, religion, culture, class, crime. I am trained as a sociologist. I have two areas of specialization in my formal training: criminology, which was in the context of a program that was also law and society and criminal justice. So it's broadly understood. I look at both, what the causal forces that lie behind crime, but I also look at structures of punishment and criminal law. Not as a lawyer. I'm not trained as a lawyer, but I do look at it in terms I do have a working understanding of the criminal law, and that what broadly conceived, let me put it this way, what we call the criminal justice process, right? So from sort of studying the criminogenic forces in society and within the individual, how that enters into the criminal justice process, which begins with either identification of a crime or reporting of a crime, then the involvement of law enforcement, then through the court system, and then in the prison system. And my dissertation was about race, class, crime, and punishment over the course of U.S. history. The second emphasis I have, or specialization, formal training, fits in with that, and my dissertation was really an intersection of criminal justice process and political economy. So that's my second area of specialization, particularly interested in international political economy, globalization, transnationalization, and then the political sociological piece is the ideologies of transnationalism, of globalism, and related ideologies, multiculturalism, and so forth. So I'm particularly interested in the question of social class, race, and we just came through a trial. Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis police officer who on May 25th, 2020, was called to the scene of a crime had occurred, and the person who had been taken into custody, George Floyd, was resisting arrest aggressively. Chauvin and his partner were called for backup, and they entered into the situation. Chauvin was the senior law enforcement officer of the four who were involved. There was another law enforcement officer who also showed up, was tasked with watching the car that George Floyd had been driving and two detainees who were in that vehicle with him. One we now know was allegedly, should be clear about that, likely the person who gave Floyd the drugs that he was on. He had ingested what's known as a speedball, fentanyl, which is a very powerful opiate, and then methamphetamine was combined with that. And we don't know the full story there. This person has, and you can read about this on my blog, the identity of the person and background and so forth. But this person has pleaded the fifth. His attorney saying that he may incriminate himself, and given if you give somebody drugs and they die from the drugs, or die in association with having taken the drugs you've given them, then you risk a third-degree murder charge. So, pleaded the Fifth. This is the Fifth Amendment, which protects individuals from self-incrimination. In any case, the video that was shown of Derek Chauvin using a control hold on George Floyd, for about 9.5 minutes. It was initially said to be about 8.5 minutes or so. And when I saw the video initially, I knowing police tactics, recognized what this was. It's a control hold. What it involves is putting one knee, or really the lower leg, across in a kneeling position across the upper back of the subject, which doesn't block the airway and allows them to move their head, which you can see throughout the video that George Floyd's his head is not pinned to the ground, and his airway is not obstructed, and his blood flow is not obstructed. So it's a way of by putting your leg across the shoulders, of keeping a person from being able to raise up and fight back. And then the other knee goes across the back, lower back, and then you have an officer, and there was multiple body cams going, so you can see this, officers who then hold the lower part of the person down, and they're lying in a prone position, and a lot has been made out of that, made of that, saying that it risks positional asphyxiation, but we have to be careful with that conclusion. Positional asphyxiation is a thing, but it's associated with obesity. It's actually a safe position. People sleep in that position. If a person is suspected of being on drugs, which this person was, it's actually safe in that if they begin regurgitating, this way the matter doesn't get into their lungs. It's very dangerous to be on your back in that situation. So that's a hold that the Minneapolis Police Department over the last 5 years prior to this event had used close to 250 times without any fatalities. There were a minority of those who were put in this position were rendered unconscious, but there's a variation of this position in which the blood flow is cut off through pressure of the neck, temporary, causing the person to pass out. It's a technique, and there's various ways to do this. In mixed martial arts, you'll see this. It's called tapping out. But that's not the hold that was being used in this case. And there were no deaths and there were no injuries from the past use of this control tactic. So when the coroner's report or medical examiner's report first came out, which talked about level of fentanyl and George Floyd's health condition, he had an enlarged heart, he had blocked arteries, severely blocked arteries, hypertension, and other health conditions, and he had COVID at the time, which we know is associated with breathing problems. When I saw that report, and I recognized, and I understand that what you saw looks terrible when you watch it, it's just absolutely terrible to see. But I know that there are, of course, if you know the control hold, if you know what it is, and you still don't like it, okay. But I think a lot of people reacted to it because they didn't know what it was, and it looks bad, and the man died. So, but I warned people back in the summer, and then of course we had the riots begin immediately, and I blogged about this extensively. I had warned people that there was these facts that were going to come out, that the defense was going to make this argument when if and when this went to trial. And there are a lot of particulars about, and of course, as we know, it went to trial, and there's a lot of things about the charges, the three charges that were leveled, and there's one charge is in contradiction to the other charges. In fact, one charge was at first dropped and then reinstated, and so it's pretty. But I don't want to get into all of that. What I want to do is just talk about sort of being on the jury, and what if I were sitting on the jury, what would I see? And I want to be upfront about this, that as I'm watching the trial, and juries are already coming to a conclusion in their minds, I'm coming to a conclusion in my mind as I watch the trial. And I didn't blog about it very much, and didn't Facebook it or tweet about it or whatever. Just was watching, and I developed reasonable doubt as to the guilt of Chauvin. And I want to tell you that the main reason why, and on the jury, I would have voted to acquit. And there's a larger context, obviously, with the question of race. I didn't see race involved in this at all. And I actually am quite troubled by the way in which race was made, such a big deal was made out of that aspect, that this was an example of systemic racism and policing. Because I know the data on that, I know the studies on that, and I've blogged about this extensively. There have been, since starting over the past 4 or 5 years, there have been wealth of studies that have been published. By wealth, I mean, I'm talking a half a dozen or more really detailed, careful studies that don't find systemic racism in policing. What do we mean by systemic racism? Well, this involves a kind of a more detailed analysis, because I'm not sure exactly what systemic racism is supposed to be. It's a very abstract term. If by systemic racism and institutional racism, which is what it's also known as, that was an earlier term used, we mean that the institutions of our society, let's say, to give you a concrete example, Jim Crow segregation, where Black people weren't allowed to go into restaurants, or they weren't allowed to drink from the same water fountains and so forth, then that's an example of institutional racism. And since that system was dismantled, and in fact it's illegal to do that, it's hard to understand what the institutional racism is today. If you broaden out systemic racism to say, well, there's patterns of collective behavior, that result in, it's a rather vague idea. Certainly you can't get there, and I made this argument a lot on my blog, you can't get there through abstraction, because then you commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness when you somehow suppose that white people are the bearers of some of white supremacy without any evidence. When you make an accusation, you really need to make the accusation at the level of the individual. When you argue for collective action, that becomes difficult. Well, clearly a mob is acting in a certain way, and that's collective. But apart from that, this white supremacy argument, it's like white privilege argument, is very, very vague in the background. Well, speaking of the mob, there was also this was part of racism of the day. If you go back to Jim Crow, is the intimidation of juries and intimidation of the judge by white mobs in order to get a conviction of a Black man. And then going further, we go back, then we find lynching and actually breaking into jails, or being allowed to break into jails to take a Black person out and lynch them. So those are the clear patterns of mob violence, and we'd have race riots where white mobs would attack Black communities. And so we see those are examples of racism. Well, we don't see that, not from white people. And so that's all very problematic. But so that apart, because what happens is there's a conflation of the independent-dependent variable in these arguments. So they'll say systemic racism is what causes these things. And you say, but what can you show me that? And can't show you that. And so the next thing that happens, next approach is taken, and it almost always happens this way, is that racial disparity in itself is indicative of racism. So the fact that black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police officers than white men is systemic racism. So they don't, by making the argument that way, you don't have to prove it. You just look at a disparity. But what the research shows, so getting back to that research, is that when you control for involvement in serious and violent crime, and when you look at contextual factors, that racial disparity is explained by black overrepresentation in serious violent crime. And I'm not going to rehash all that because I do talk about that on my blog, and so you can read about it there in great detail. So there's several studies, and it's not just over the last 4 or 5 years. These studies go all, 1987 with William Wilbank's The Myth of the Racist Criminal Justice System. This is also true for mass incarceration. If you see overrepresentation, let me just give you a real brief analogy, which I talked about recently on my blog. The vast majority of people who are shot by the police are men. So women, there are women shot by the police. There's a recent incident of that happening, in fact, but it's quite rare, or it's a small proportion of the people shot by the police. One wouldn't suppose that the police were targeting men, that they were sexist in that way. The reason that men are more likely to be shot, much more likely to be shot by the police, is they're much more likely to be involved in serious criminal offending, which brings them into contact with the police. Sorry, I just dropped my phone there. I'm trying to put it in my lap so it doesn't vibrate and I can turn it off quickly. Let me see if I can do a better job hanging on to it. Okay. So just because you see racial disparity, just because you see a sexual disparity in that case, doesn't mean that the police are biased. So the disparity is not an explanation of itself. You need to have the explanation. So all of these cases that we're seeing, the media is focusing on the black victims of police violence, and we'll put it in the strongest terms there. They're not telling you about white victims of police violence when twice as many white men are killed by the police as black men. And that will shock you it shocks people when they hear it, but it's true. And why is the media talking about that? Okay. So there's a false perception out there. And when I see these things, I'm looking to see what the evidence of racism is. And I don't see it. And I don't see it in the case of George Floyd. So when I'm sitting on the jury, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to push all that. I can't let that affect me, right? I can't say I'm going to convict Chauvin because I believe as a white man he's a representative of white supremacy, and he is the embodiment of systemic racism, and we need to have collective justice in this case, social justice in this case, and so I'm going to find him guilty in order to advance the cause of anti-racism. So I have to avoid that, thinking that. And 5-6 years ago, when before I really got into all these data, I would have had to have really said to myself very intentionally, judge this case on its merits. Don't judge it based on your feelings about race inequity and systemic racism and those sorts of things. Now it's easier to be able to hold that at bay, I think, because there's no evidence of it, and you don't see any evidence of it in this case. And so just because you see a black man underneath a white man doesn't mean it's racism. So I had to say that. That's an important piece of it. Now, so let's just get into not all the facts. You can watch the trial. I watched the whole thing. And as I'm watching it, I'm going, okay, so first of all, let me just say what I believe happened was, and it had to do with the ingestion of fentanyl and methamphetamine, and a man with an enlarged heart, and blockage of arteries, hypertension, and all of this. got his heart rate up by struggling, fighting with police officers. Got his adrenaline going, and he had a cardiac event, and he died there on the pavement. Died of a heart attack. His heart stopped. Now, so right off the bat, when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, so we can talk about whether what Chauvin did was proper, and it was a control hold being used against a man who was violently resisting arrest. In fact, at one point, the defense attorney, there was a witness who said, if he had not been put on the pavement and put under put in that hole, that he would still be alive. And the defense attorney said, so what you're saying is that had he gotten into the car like he was ordered, he'd still be alive. It's a very powerful moment. I'm not convinced he'd still be alive if he got in the car. Maybe because he wouldn't have continued to struggle, and maybe the adrenaline, he could have calmed down, and all that stress on his heart would have been less, and it's possible. Certainly if he'd had a cardiac event in the car, the police officers could have driven him to the hospital. So I'm not convinced that if he got in the car, he would have lived. I think that the cardiac event was imminent. And that's what killed him. So if that's what killed him, I can't find Chauvin guilty of murder. I just can't, because he didn't kill George Floyd. I think you have that, or the other option, at the very most you can come up with, is that you don't know. It was a multitudinous event. You don't know what killed George Floyd. So if you don't know, that's reasonable doubt. And you certainly can't show, I don't believe you can show that Chauvin putting him in a control hold under those circumstances was what killed him. Now, there is one issue that is gives me pause, and that is that, well, what about when he stops breathing and he doesn't have a pulse? Then don't you get off him at that point and start providing CPR? Well, there's a couple of three things that you have to consider there. One is that these aren't doctors, so when Floyd is moving his legs, they don't know that that's a seizure necessarily after a person dies. I think a person dies, they continue to kick, and you can clearly see Floyd is doing that. And so one of the arguments is, well, he was dead and he wasn't, so don't interpret that as him being alive. Well, it's nice to be told that, but in the moment, how do you know that? And so if anybody looks at that, they're thinking, well, he's moving his legs, he must be alive. So there were contradictory indications of George Floyd's state at that point. Secondly, the crowd was growing more hostile as it was going on. And in fact, Chauvin at one point, had to bring out his pepper spray because he was worried about the crowd attacking the officers. And so he was distracted. So his attention is divided between maintaining this hold and trying to ascertain the condition of George Floyd and trying to judge the situation with the crowd. And so that's a confusing, and so you have to take that into consideration. The other thing is they called EMS, so they knew EMS was on the way. And and they would be better equipped to deal with a health emergency. And so there were all of these factors. And so you could say Chauvin should have done this, should have done that. But does failure to do that under those circumstances mean that he's guilty of these charges? Again, somewhat contradictory, because you're having to find intent, and I don't see the intent there. So that's reasonable doubt. So I wanted to make that clear. It's terrible that George Floyd died. I know that people are upset when you bring up his past crimes, which were really awful, robbery and so forth. That he had a record. Of course, that's known to police officers. That you bring up his drug use. I know that that's uncomfortable, but that's part of the explanation for what happened. And we do have that 2019 arrest where we see the same pattern, the same way in which George Floyd responds, way he resists. Although in 2019 he didn't resist nearly as strenuously as he resisted here. He was resisting all the way. So we could get into the things he was saying, the things he was doing, and also about how important it is for you to teach your children, as I've taught my children, that to not resist, because the police are going to affect an arrest. It's what they're, the person committed a crime. They're being arrested, taken into custody. If they resist, the police can use force to affect an arrest. And the more the person resists, then the more the police are allowed to ramp up their force. And if you look at the training that Chauvin went through, if you look at the level of resistance, the level of force that was used was appropriate. So, and I know there's a tendency for people to want to say, well, you blame the victim because they're resisting. Well, there is a thing we study in criminology called victim precipitated injury or homicide, and that it's what the victim did, and we're using victim here. That's a sort of a prejudicial term in itself. So maybe we should say the suspect. There are things that people do that increase the likelihood of injury or death, and that's self-caused. It's their actions that do that. And if the police officers have a legitimate power, which is authority, if they have the authority to in effect arrest, and we want them to, there is this weird argument the prosecution makes that George Floyd couldn't bring himself to get into the car, et cetera, et cetera. But as if a suspect doesn't like what the officer is doing, doesn't like being arrested, doesn't like being put in a squad car, that somehow the officer is supposed to just let them go or stop trying to arrest them. That doesn't make any sense. Finally, I want to say that the prosecution, and I had in mind when I started doing this podcast to actually put a picture up, but you can find it online. I don't want you to have to dwell on pictures, of George Floyd in that position. You can certainly find it, and the prosecution dwelled on it. Even the defense dwelled on it, and it's been blamed for that. But the defense had to dwell on it for a while because one thing, there's lots of things the prosecution did. I mean, generally speaking, you should try the facts of the case. Their arguments, the prosecution was, okay, so they had expert testimony, you have the facts and all of that. As I said, I came to a conclusion based on those facts. But the way in which the prosecution pushed the emotional aspect of this, as a person who highly prizes reason, evidence and reason, it's very troubling to me to see people pushing emotion. And in any case, I mean, Derek Chauvin is not it's not a sympathetic looking figure. It's not a sympathetic figure, I guess we could say. I mean, you look at him and you're thinking, he's a cop. He looks like a cop. Cops are getting a bad rap these days. He's white. He's got short hair, very closely cropped. And, I guess media shows me plenty of pictures of white supremacists. And he's sitting there, and you're thinking, okay. That's why people are saying, why didn't he take the stand? And it's like, well, first of all, you don't have to take the stand because silence is not an indication of guilt. Although, as Troy Gowdy pointed out, what he is a prosecutor, he says, when I see somebody take the fifth, I see a convict. And so it's very difficult to push back against that. But I don't think there's any way that Chauvin could have gotten on the stand and have been a sympathetic figure. And moreover, it would have exposed his disciplinary record to examination. And if you know about the interactions between cops and civilians, cops have disciplinary records. They have complaints against them and so forth. Lots. Because people don't like being arrested, roughed up, and those sorts of things. So it wasn't that the defense could really play the emotional part, is what I'm getting at. So the prosecution played it to the hilt, and that's very troubling to me. But there was the other troubling aspect of the prosecution was the outright deceit. And I'll just give you one example. So there was a picture that the prosecution dwelled on for quite some time that showed Derek Chauvin. And let me just make sure that you understand this hold where you've got a knee across the upper back. They say on the neck. They constantly say on the neck. Watch it. And moreover, Chauvin moves his position from time to time. George Floyd is able to move his head up and down. His head is not being constrained. His neck is not immobilized. His neck it's not blocking his breathing. So he's talking. He's moving his head. And so this is across the upper back, and so watch it. You can see it's on the upper back. Chauvin adjusts his position several times, keep his balance, keep Floyd down, and then there's the other leg, right? And at one point in shifting his position, Chauvin's foot comes off the ground by about that much, so his toes up, and they say here he is putting his full weight. And Chauvin, his police officer, weighs, I forget the exact weight, did have, his utility belt, which adds weight and so forth. George Floyd was a huge man. And so when you just look at that picture, you say, oh my goodness, he's putting his full weight knee right down on George Floyd's neck. So just think about the way that you're talking about it. This is full weight on George Floyd's neck. Well, a picture is just one frame that's taken from the video. If you step back and watch that video, you'll see that happens just for a split second. It happens when Chauvin is adjusting his position. So he's leaning back, straight up, back on the balls of his feet, which means that he's putting pressure on Floyd, but he's not fully putting his full weight on Floyd. His knee's not on Floyd's neck, it's on his upper back. Floyd can move his head around, he can breathe. There's no neck compression, just on his back. So no blockage of the throat, and he's not being choked. His blood is not being cut off to his brain, and so forth. So, and Chauvin's leaning back. Now, when he's adjusting his position, he raises his foot up briefly, just for a second, and puts it back down. Now, this is very dishonest for the prosecution to take this picture and leave it up there and dwell on this picture and say, as if this is what Chauvin was doing, that his knee on Floyd's neck, that his foot was off the ground, he was putting all of his weight down on his neck, when none of that's true. And so you have the prosecution, which represents the state. This is the state. The state represents the people in a republic. So you've got the prosecution, you've got the attorney representing the people, misleading the people, and a witness. And this is the part that it's so amazing to me about this, is that I can understand how the civilian can look at a control hold like that and can say, oh my goodness, that's terrible. It looks terrible. Why don't let police do this? And maybe we shouldn't let police do this. Maybe they should have put him in the hobble. Maybe they should have used, but escalated it. They certainly shouldn't have let him out of the car. They should have forced him into the car, closed the door, taken him to jail, or if he'd had the cardiac event, then take him to the emergency room. They should, not now. So I mean, putting him on the ground, just say, well, they should have put him in the car, therefore they shouldn't have put him on the ground. Those two things are not connected. I want to make that clear. Because once they took him out of the car, because he wanted out of the car, and he thanked them for taking him out of the car. Once they'd done that, they still had to restrain him. So I rather naive, I think, of police officers to believe that they would get greater compliance by taking him out of the car. All those were steps in his mind of not being taken to jail. That's what I see as somebody. If you're resisting, it means you don't want to go to jail. You've been there plenty of times. You didn't want to go back to jail. And so So I understand how that, but that the witnesses would get up there, police officers who know what that control hold is, who have practiced using it, who've had it practiced on them, because when you do these training exercises, you play roles, who've had it practiced on them, who know that it's uncomfortable to be in that position for sure, but that it's not painful in the sense that it's not a pain compliance technique. Pain compliance technique would be bending the fingers, right? Bending the wrist, bending the arm, using pain to get somebody to cooperate. That's pain compliance. It's not a pain compliance, so it's not painful in that sense. From what I can tell, it was being applied properly. For police officers to get up there and to say the things that they said is also very troubling, because they know. And so I saw the prosecution put on a case that was intended to affect the emotions of the jurors, that used deception, that misled the jurors about what was happening. I saw the defense, and we could criticize the defense for various things, but I saw the defense doing a good job of establishing reasonable doubt. If I were sitting on the jury, I would have made the argument to my fellow jurors: George Floyd died of a cardiac event. The medical examiner testified to that. Experts testified to that. It fits what you're seeing, standing back and looking at it. That if George Floyd died of a cardiac event, and that what precipitated that cardiac event was his resisting arrest, aided by an ingestion of fentanyl, which is quite lethal opiate. If that's what caused George Floyd's death, then Chauvin's not responsible for his death. It just can't be. If George Floyd died for some other reason, and if a person dies resisting police officers from a cardiac event, or has a stroke or something like that, it's the resisting that gets the heart rate up, that triggers that. Police officers, again, are authorized to take a person into custody, so it's not their fault. So if Chauvin, if I can't come to the conclusion that Chauvin killed George Floyd, how can I convict him of murder? And so it wouldn't have been 10 hours with me. And if all the other jurors disagree with me, might be a hung jury, it'd be mistrial. And I could completely live with my role in creating that outcome. But to be honest, and I can't get inside the jurors' heads, but there was intimidation of the jury. And when you say the defense had asked for a change of venue, as I understand it, the defense was concerned about the fact that the jury was not sequestered. This was these were residents of a community that had gone through the riotous aftermath of George Floyd, and the whole country went through that. Billions of dollars in damages, scores of people, it really is true, were killed by this, injured, widespread looting, arson, destruction of monuments, destruction of property, vandalism. That this decision was worth billions more had they acquitted. You just can imagine. One of the things we know is that Maxine Waters and others were whipping up a mob, and they were saying that if they acquit Floyd, then you've got to be more confrontational than what? Than they already were. Well, it was already bad enough. So just imagine what more confrontational would mean in terms of riots. And so and these are grounds for an appeal. There are lots of grounds for appeal. There's legal reasons for an appeal. But the fact that the jurors could have been, and so again, we're not inside their heads, but they could have been felt intimidated, that the judge could have felt intimidated, raises some real problems with this trial. Those things could, if sequester the jury, change a venue. The judge's choice of words could have been better in some of this. There would be a way that you could have a fair trial. Now, if on appeal the case is the judgment, the ruling is overturned, then we could see these riots return, and there'll be riots anyway, because the way the media is focusing on blacks who die at the hands of police officers, and given the amount of crime in our society, particularly that crime's been going up during this whole. So by the way, we were on like a 30, 40 year decline in serious crime, violent crime. Now we're seeing 30-year high of crime. Our cities are, and this is what happens when you depolice, when you delegitimize policing, law enforcement, the law, but also create hesitancy among law enforcement officers to carry out their duties. And you also then preach a gospel that says, hey, the reason that you're poor and suffering and so forth is because of white privilege and white supremacy, and you're owed reparations, and you're not getting reparations through the government. Well, then you can have, if you will, reparations in kind by looting stores and all these sorts of things. So all of this is feeding into what Frederick Engels in the mid-19th century called demoralization, demoralizing a population. They have no stake in conformity. They have no stake in obedience to the rule of law, which is a public safety concern, and particularly in these communities that are already crime-ridden. Where, I mean, just consider that black people are 12-13% of the U.S. population. Half of the homicides that occur are black people, and the vast majority of those who are the perpetrators of their deaths are other blacks. And so these communities, and crime drives out business. It's depolicing, defund the police. All of that is just a dreadful idea. So the way the media is focusing on that, and given that it is inevitable that there will be, and that there already have been, black victims of police violence, that there's rioting still over those, this decision will probably do little to quell the rage of the mob. So not knowing what was going through the jurors' heads, it is reasonable to believe that in the back of their minds was a desire to do justice in the way that it's now being framed as social justice rather than individual justice, rather than finding a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest burden, a defendant who's presumed innocent, that we no longer think in those terms. That's what the critical race theorists call the perpetrator's perspective. We no longer think in those terms. We think in the victim's perspective. We look at the victim and we say there's a victim here. And that victim is an embodiment of a whole group of victims, a victim group, and we want to seek justice for them. That is in the back of the minds of jurors, and this is in Minneapolis, arguably the most progressive city in the United States. Lots of social justice thinking, anti-racism, etc. But also what's back of their mind is we've just seen our city go through this turmoil. We don't want to see it go through that turmoil again. If there's a guilty verdict, if there's a not guilty verdict, we'll see that. We got Maxine Waters and others out there telling us that in fact, if we acquit, that's going to happen. So an acquittal will result in more riots, more destruction, more death. It's reasonable to assume that and I expected a guilty verdict. That now I expected a not guilty based on facts and reason. I expected guilty based on emotion and ideology. I think it was very difficult to imagine how the jury could have overcome overcome the context in which this trial occurred. In any case, I wanted to explain my thinking about that. And until next time, this is the FAR podcast. I'm Andrew Austin. Thanks for listening.